Hello, everybody.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment in the National Sports Forum webinar series. I'm excited for today's chat that we're going to have with Kim Cook, who's the Chief Revenue Officer of Hookit. Hookit is actually the current data analytics partner, the official data analytics partner of the National Sports Forum. So we're really excited to hear from Hookit, from Hookit's perspective on some of the things that are happening right now in the industry, specifically an industry called SponTech that we're going to kind of take a deep dive into. SponTech combines two things that we're all familiar with in the sports industry, which is sponsorship and technology, and something that Hookit is doing through providing a single source data platform for all sports sponsorships. And obviously, this is a big key thing that a lot of us are looking at. How can we measure the effectiveness of our sponsorships? And there's brands that are leading the charge, such as Anheuser-Busch, another proud sponsor of the National Sports Forum, and that really want to see, what's working, what's not working. And for the purpose of this conversation today, we really want to focus on figuring out the best ways that we, as both teams and brands in the sports industry, can pair the right fan with the right brand. So you're going to be able to hear a lot more about this, both from the brand side and from Hookit's perspective, as well as the team side, as we roll into the Fall Summit next month in San Francisco, October 9th and 10th. So we're really excited for that. But today, really want to take a deep dive on this topic. And with that being said, we'll start off, bring Kim into the conversation. Kim, if you want to quickly introduce yourself and the topic, and then we can kind of get going.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks, Josh. Thanks for everybody for joining today. As Josh mentioned, my name is Kim Cook. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Hookit. We've been in the space for about 15 years, but really pivoted into looking at data in the last 4 or 5. And the SponTech space that Josh mentioned is really kind of a nascent space where there hasn't been as much data around sponsorships as every other form of marketing. And that's really what we've been diving into on a day-to-day basis with our engineering teams and our data scientists to really make sure that there's enough granular data that proves kind of what everybody knows, that sponsorships work, but really how effective are they? So that's kind of the data that we're looking at on a regular basis from the social and digital side, just because that data is near real time, it's very rich, and TV audiences are what they are, but with social and digital, you can actually impact the value of what you're doing and measure it really quickly. So that's where we found, we concentrate our efforts just because, the data's there and we're actually able to do something about it. So we're excited to talk to you guys a little bit today, really about how we've seen this kind of evolution of sponsorship and all the data behind it. And we're looking at, on a day-to-day basis, over 500,000 entities in sport, which is looking at everything from brands to sponsors to venues to individual athletes. Stuff as exciting as watching the finals of the U.S. Open and, the impact the Canadian had overtaking Serena and what she's done for her sponsors and, just the simple impact of a big global event like that and what it actually has on the sponsorship space. So that's just one example of, stuff we're looking at on a day-to-day basis to really get our head around how the sponsorship space is evolving from both the brand side and the team side.
So, Kim, and Jordan, I think we can go to the first slide here. Kim, you talk a lot about the evolution of sponsorship. I think let's start on the brand side. What are some of the changes that are happening right now to evolve sponsorship on the brand side? As we kind of talked about, that a lot of times the brands are pushing the impetus to force change. So what are some of the big changes that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, we're really seeing the market evolve because of data and because of the need for data, because right now the sponsorship space, the amount of money that's being spent in it can no longer just be kind of an unproven entity. So, the first stage that brands have found themselves in is really kind of that kind of gut feel, which means very often the CEO likes a certain sport and used to want tickets. So they'd write a check and throw a couple signs in the signs up on a leaderboard and saying, that was worth it. From there, really what's been evolved to is kind of more of a basic measurement where the teams and leagues, the onus has been on them to provide the brands with data and to kind of prove, hey, we've written this check, we've got a few tickets, now what? So really kind of proving, all aspects of that engagement around, some sort of basic measurement, which is, here's the number of eyeballs we reached, and this is what we think it's worth. But from a brand side now, we're even a lot of folks are falling into what we're calling performance-based. So, Josh, you mentioned one of the sponsors of NSF, which is InBev, and last year, back in April, there was a Forbes article where they said they were only going to do performance-based sponsorship going forward, and we've seen a lot of brands follow suit, not only with teams and leagues, but also with individual athletes like Vans, who are putting performance-based metrics in every one of their athletes' contracts. And that's really basically what happens in the performance-based model is there is an agreed upon amount that they're paid to start the relationship. And then as they hit certain milestones around performance, like even an engagement metric or some sort of kind of minimum exposure, then they're paid more, which is great because it's a win-win. The individuals or the teams and leagues can actually make more money than what an initially agreed upon metric is if they perform well. I mean, it's kind of a great thing for them because you can actually impact it. So a lot of folks are getting to that performance-based model, and we're seeing more and more of that across the brand landscape. And then the next stage after that really is what we're calling like a predictive model. So in all other parts of marketing spend, you can say, I have this dollar. If I spend it in search or TV or something else, I know I'm going to kind of get this return on my investment. But with sponsorship, we haven't really gotten to that space. And with a bunch of data, you can essentially do predictive modeling around, hey, if I'm keeping the InBev example going, if I'm InBev and I'm sponsoring, let's say, the Jets, what could that sponsorship look like for me in the next year? And there's enough data around that engagement that we can actually work to do predictive modeling. So that's really where we're pushing a lot of our clients, if they're already doing performance-based modeling, to get into kind of the predictive element, and then eventually with all this data and with all of the essentially the inventory around it, we see sponsorship moving into the programmatic space, which basically means sponsorships can be bought and sold with good data and clear inventory without humans. So it's kind of pretty futuristic, but and that's probably 5-10 years down the road, or maybe sooner, depending on how everything gets adopted. But it's pretty cool to see the space evolving and kind of be on the cutting edge of pushing those conversations.
So, Kim, one thing that I know you mentioned a few times there was kind of talking a little bit about the old school inventory, the old school mindset of, look, I'm going to, as a CEO, I'm going to sign this check, and I want tickets, I want signage in the outfield or in the stadium or arena. And obviously, we know that has been changing over the last 5 to 10 years quite significantly. And I know that in Hooget's case, there's a really big focus on social media in order to measure sponsorship effectiveness. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's where all the data lies, right? And it's where you can access it very quickly, and it's a deep data set. But I also think it's where the fans are moving to, right? when you look at why you actually do a sponsorship, you want to engage the fan base and you want to know about who they are. And that's why sponsors have said in the study that was done by Forrester that 98% of them are actually going to activate through social media. And they rank social and digital presence only second to category exclusivity. And we're seeing that because, when you look at activation dollars versus actual sponsorship dollars, it's usually a little over 2 to 1, right? So they're spending $1 on sponsorship, they're spending over 2 on activation. And it's because of the fan engagement. And that's really why we look to social and digital to do that, because we know that's where the fans are.
I think another interesting factor about the social landscape is how quickly things can change. So obviously with where you sit and all the data that you see on a day-to-day basis, what trends are you noticing or have you noticed?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. When you look at these social media platforms, they kind of catch fire quickly, right? And being able to look at the data when you're creating content and figuring out how to really engage that audience that you're spending a lot of money to reach. The rise of Instagram has been kind of mind-boggling, where 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they really weren't on the radar. And now we're seeing the engagement around sport in particular. About 82% of it is falling on Instagram right now. Facebook still has a decent hold, and of course, they're both owned by Facebook. So when you look at that added together, the Facebook Instagram juggernaut is actually controlling about 96% of what is going on in terms of engagement. Twitter's on the rise a little bit as well, because they've added video now. That it's kind of handled a little more as a news feed than an actual, as much video engagement as what Instagram has been pushing with stories and all the different features they have. And then, YouTube is kind of longer term engagement, but they look at it, it's valuable because it's looked at a younger audience where people are really trying to reach. So, but the real story around, the platforms is just kind of really the rise and dominance of Instagram. We had a look after the Pyeongchang Olympics, and 86% of all the interactions around the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, happened on Instagram, which is kind of pretty crazy that that's where everything actually ended up being. So it was actually surprising to us when we looked at the data, but it's what it showed. So it's definitely, when you're a brand or even a team or a league, or even somebody as impactful as the Olympic movement, like knowing where the audience is and making sure you're putting kind of compelling, engaging content that they'll, kind of latch onto.
I'm curious, looking at, especially with, you talk about huge properties like the Olympics or the NFL, when just in the last couple of weeks, the NFL has announced several new content partnerships with Reddit, TikTok, and YouTube as well. What type of impact do you see that having, if any? Because these numbers are pretty pretty eye-opening when you see 96% of the interactions going through a Facebook platform or Instagram. So how much effect do you see those type of partnerships having, if any?
I think they're going to have huge impact. I mean, a lot of the leagues and the Olympic movement, as you mentioned, they're looking for what the audience, kind of next audience is going to be. So when you look at platforms like Reddit and TikTok, they're engaging different parts of the world, right? Especially with TikTok and Reddit's just kind of a whole different animal, right? So I think the key for people is to really, if you see where the larger leagues are going to, they've obviously identified those as audience they want to reach. So from a brand perspective, it's really telling to be able to see where those new pockets of fans are going to live and be, that you're going to have to think about what kind of content that you put in front of those particular audiences to engage them. You know, the TikTok audience is and Reddit audience is a much different audience than what the Instagram audience is. So it's really important to think around the elements of what you're putting out there that's going to engage those people. But you know, obviously the bigger sports entities have identified that those are markets that they can capture that they don't currently have. You know, I think when you think of leagues like the NBA, who have a huge presence on Weibo and some of the other you know, networks outside of kind of the big four we noted here, those are huge opportunities for them to grow their impact worldwide. And from a brand perspective, it's great because they're making those efforts into audiences they may not have captured with, you know, that old school of buying some tickets and throwing up a couple signs in a particular venue that you know, whatever competition is they're sponsoring. So it's a really great way of expanding your sponsorship impact globally.
And I couldn't agree more. And I think kind of piggybacking off some of that point where you're talking about getting, you know, strategically using different platforms to get in front of different audiences from a team, league, brand perspective. When it comes to aligning audiences for a partnership, we know that teams and brands can use the data in a lot of different ways. Let's start with the team side.
Sure.
Which data do you think, from where you sit, which data should the teams be looking at? Yeah,
there's a lot of data that the teams can look at to. It's basically really comes down to knowing their fan base really well. So you know, I think if you kind of pop into that next slide, if people are doing the visual, I mean, there's so much data around the fan side and who's engaging with that audience. So if you're a team, and this just has a kind of anonymized Dodger example in there, but knowing the folks that they're reaching is really important in defining it, because brands are specific about who they're trying to reach, right? They know what they're trying to do with these sponsorships. And honestly, you know, we've been working with so many of the top brands globally. We're seeing that they're a lot more sophisticated than a lot of the teams are giving them credit for on who they're reaching. And they actually have a lot more data around that than the teams do. So it's really incumbent for the teams to make sure that they know who's sitting in their audience and who's engaging socially and digitally. So some of the stuff that we track for teams is around like very specific stuff, not only just kind of the basic age, gender, ethnicity. It's really kind of around salary range, their interests, what type of stuff they're talking about. Because we can get as specific as knowing like the top hashtags, and then, you know, the actual specific interests. So you might have, you know, a bunch of music fans or a bunch of folks that are super interested in automobiles that you haven't identified unless you kind of get into some of this data and know it. But brands are looking for teams to really make sure that they have their handle on who they can engage with this content that they produce together. So really getting their head around that at a deeper level, other than, hey, you know what, we're the Red Sox and we've got everybody in Boston. It's definitely getting to the point where people have to be more specific about that. I'm not picking on the Red Sox, I'm just using an example. But you know, anybody that's sitting in the seat in any particular market, they need to know. And if you're not able to bring that to the table for a brand, you're going to be less desirable than somebody that does.
So for someone like myself, who, I mean, I love looking at this type of graphic with some really interesting insights. Now, where does that data come from? And then once we can identify that from the property side, how can we use that data?
Yeah, so this data is all derived from social metrics. And so we are tapped into the social platforms APIs. As most people know, some are more generous with data than others. So it's a combination of multiple data sources to pull this in. And what you can do with this is kind of a multitude of things. So I think the thing from a team and league perspective is you have to not only know your audience, but you also have to know the brand's audience. So if you click down to the next slide, when you go sit in front of somebody, you should have a pretty good knowledge of what they're doing and what matters to them. So not only do you have to really know your audience, you have to know how your audience actually overlaps with the brand's audience, what they're trying to reach. So, and then also there's a lot of good ways to think through what they're doing currently. So this is a kind of an anonymized example of, here's a particular brand. This shows from the data that we're able to derive, like where they're spending their money right now, and then who they're probably spending their money on. It's kind of cool because we actually look on social media who's talking about who. So we have a pretty good idea of there's some sort of agreement in place, some sort of sponsorship. So we're pretty good about predicting who's working with who. And then there's some cool ways of actually going in before you go talk to a sponsor. Look at what they're doing, right? Look at what they're doing in social media already. Look at the partnerships they currently have, because obviously if they're doing things that are working, you can be really smart about the data and say, okay, listen, we've got these audiences that overlap, and we see you're doing these kind of engagements, so they're probably working. So we could do something similar, or hey, we've got another idea because we have this kind of unique audience that we know overlaps with what you guys have, but we also know that maybe they're super interested in music. So having some sort of, act or, performance in the game that's going to attach our name to it and involve all these people in a really positive way might be a really cool thing to think of together. And then I think this next slide that you popped up here just gives you a little idea of like how you can tell from a team perspective, tell your story to a brand, right? Which is really around, hey, this is just another random example of, hey, I'm the Eagles. How do I rank within, from all the other NFL teams, right? Like they're great around engagement on Twitter. They are, hugely impactful on Facebook. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of look at yourself from a team perspective within either your league or, the sports landscape as a whole on how you perform. So that helps a brand decide like, hey, if I'm looking at 32 teams in the NFL, how do you guys work for me, right? And it isn't always the number of followers, right? Which I think a lot of people have kind of used as a default, but it's really with those followers who you engage and how. And that's kind of the next level conversations that you can have with a brand that I think they appreciate because they know you've done your research and they know you care about what they care about. And then you're also telling the story of how you impact that particular audience as well.
So we talk about it from the team side, but switching to the brand side for the InBevs of the world, what data should brands be looking at?
Yeah, there's like I mentioned before, there's a ton of data out there that they can look at. One of the cool things is brands usually have a pretty good idea of who they're trying to reach. They've invested in data for a really long time on, what that audience looks like, but knowing that in a very real way and how it overlaps with someone that they're actually thinking about doing some sort of sponsorship with is really important. So let's say, I don't mean to keep picking on InBev, but we can use that example. Let's say they're launching a new hard seltzer, right? Which is kind of a hot new category. and they want to know, they know what that audience is. They've done a ton of market research, but it's like, how is somebody from the Eagles gonna, is that the audience I need to reach? And if so, how do we engage them properly? So looking at kind of knowing the market research data that they have, and then seeing how it overlaps with someone that they're going to do business with, that's kind of where the gold is, right? And then really looking at, once you've identified that audience, how to engage them properly is kind of the next bit, where you can look at content from competitors and what's worked. You can kind of benchmark yourself against other folks in your category or just as a whole, on really, that audience and how you're reaching them versus other folks in your space.
So from where you sit, what do you see as the difference between how brands are using the data versus how the teams use the data?
Yeah, I think the teams generally come at it from this is who we are, because they're very proud of their heritage as a team. And brands look at it as, hey, here's a segment of the population that's highly engaged because they're super fired up about the team that they're watching. And how does my product or service fit into that audience? So I think, brands usually look at it with a pretty critical lens. And there's a lot of cool ways that brands can look at it. Like we've developed something that has definitely been a demand from a lot of the brands we work with, which is, you know what, how do I identify who works for me? And this slide that you have up here, we have some ways in our tool where people can look at not only a team or a league, but also an individual athlete. So as you know, Tokyo 2020 is coming up. A lot of brands are trying to figure out, who do I sponsor, right? Because a lot of times Olympics, people just, from the aspect of kind of the social consciousness, people come out of nowhere, right? But there's people that you can identify early on before that, based on their social media presence and the sport they're in. It's not always about the number of followers, it's how they engage the people that they're actually working with. So this is an example of, we have something we call our watch list. So they could look at, here's a bunch of athletes that are the demo that I'm interested in, who's kind of up and comers. And they could do it also from a team perspective too. Like, hey, here's a team or a league that I'm interested in. Like, I'm just going to keep an eye on them and see how they're doing. So it's kind of a cool way brands can look at, future state, because a lot of times, these folks, you've got to identify them a year out before they hit the collective consciousness. Like, a really good example of that is we work with New Balance, and they signed Coco Gauff before she had her big run at Wimbledon. Listen, I'd like to say it's all data. Some of it's data, and some of it was just pretty good luck that she kind of burst on the scene. But she was definitely, somebody that was on the rise, and she's 15, so who would have known she would have made such a splash so quickly? But they have a lot of data to help think about that space and keep an eye on a few of these folks and do a deal with them before they got big. So. I think everybody, I don't mean to keep talking about tennis, but it just happens, so it's kind of relevant. But stuff like that, you can actually discover these things with data early on, because the stories are there. It's kind of like breadcrumbs leading you to the kind of promised land, and the breadcrumbs are the data. And this is kind of a cool way where a lot of brands are leveraging stuff like this, and not just from Hookit, from other places too, but like the ways that they can narrow down on a lot of this stuff with data is pretty sophisticated. And this stuff didn't exist before. So we were talking about that SponTech space. It's like brands didn't have their hands on this data through this kind of lens, through sponsorship, even 2-3 years back.
You talk about like all of the cool things that we can see with data. I'm curious whether it's an athlete or a team or a property league, whatever it is, as brands are looking to figure out who the best match is, are you able to get as granular as, okay, I want to look at the engagement of a particular athlete or a team on their, through their social presence, but from a brand's perspective, you might not want things to get watered down in terms of, I want to look at only the other sponsored posts and the type of engagement that they get on those sponsored posts. Is that, I mean, can we get as granular as that? And then from that, looking at, okay, the sponsored posts that get more engagement or less engagement, what types of posts are those, or what types of content are they pushing out, and how granular can we really get with the data?
Yeah, I mean, that's really the cool part about data in general. I mean, we can get as granular as, here's a single post, here's how much it's worth, here is the quality score of that post, and from our platform, you can actually hit share and share it directly with that person, whether it has a dollar amount in it or not, and how they can get better. And then the other thing that brands have pushed us to develop is we have something that we're calling the promotional effectiveness score. And it basically is a way of looking at everybody you deal with, whether it's a team, a league, an individual athlete, and gives them a scorecard, very much like you got in school, right? You got your report card. It's kind of like having a report card across everything you're sponsoring. And it takes out the weight of a follower and just says, or how many followers somebody has, and just says, this is how good they are at promoting brands, promoting my brand. And it's a really cool way for brands to say, you know what, somebody like Coco Gauff may only have a couple 100,000 followers. I'm also paying Cristiano Ronaldo, who's got 380 million followers. How do I look at them kind of equally and say who's better and who's doing really well for me, period. Brands know how much money they're paying these individual folks, whether it's a team, league, or an athlete. And this promotional effectiveness score is a way of really saying, with all things equal, without followers being counted in, how do I see what's effective for my brand? And that's another way that brands really look at engaging. So the summary there is, yeah, you can get as granular as an individual post, and then you can shove them all together and look at something as big as like a PE score. If you're looking at, reporting up to an executive to say, hey, I've sponsored these 10 athletes. These 4 folks have a score above 90, so they're doing great for us. These 4 people, we may be paying them a lot of money, but they only have a score of about 30. So why are we paying them this much money? Like, let's look at this in a really smart way. So I always kind of say it's kind of a cool way of looking at it, very much like if you have an E-Trade portfolio, right? You've got all these stocks, and then you've got all this data around them. This is kind of what we're doing in the sponsorship space, right? So you've got all these different things you're thinking of investing in. You need to have the data around it to be able to say what's working, what's not, and why. But yeah, you can zoom out as big as kind of looking at it across their whole portfolio, or you can zoom in as granular as like, here's this one single post. It delivered $35,000 for us in value, and this is why, and this is how we got there. So it's pretty cool to be able to get that kind of granular data, because that's how brands can actually impact those sponsorships. So when a brand has done a multi-year sponsorship with a team, a league, or an individual, which most of them are, they can actually do something about it. They can collaborate. They can collaborate on content. They can collaborate on content that gets the kind of engagement they want, and represents their brand and represents the team or league or the individual in a really authentic way. Because when something's done authentically, you're rewarded with engagement, right? So that's really another way you can take that really granular data and do something about it. I think the toughest thing when people grab data and there's all this data available, but none of it's really effective unless you can do something about it. So we really focus on giving people really actionable ways to do something about it. And it's kind of cool because the data is the data. So the teams can see it, the brands can see it, and then they're all kind of speaking the same language, which I think has been really difficult in the past because there really hasn't been kind of a universally accepted language on how to make sponsorships better.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. We're talking about it's one of the most common things that we hear, whether it's a sponsor of the National Sports Forum to a sponsor of the National Football League, is every brand or sponsoring company wants an authentic activation, something that's really going to drive home what the message that they're trying to send out there to the world, no matter what it is. So obviously, getting to see the effectiveness of some of the activations is very valuable for both the team and the brand to see what works. But taking a step back, and let's say from the brand or the team perspective, you have all this data, you've identified from a brand side, you've identified a couple of properties, or maybe one property in particular, one athlete that you think would be a good fit with your brand, that you will be able to activate authentically through, and that there's a partnership established. Or from a team side, you've done a good job of telling the story with the data to the brand as to why they would be a good partner. And okay, we've established the partnership. So what are the next steps from your eyes, Kim, that a brand and a property could go in from the outside of a partnership?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think, some of the things I like to share is really like who's doing stuff on the cutting edge, right? And one of the things that one of our brand partners and a few of them have pushed us to is, hey, if I'm a brand, I have these what they call personas that they're trying to reach, right? So big, one of the big shoe brands, whether it's Nike, New Balance, Puma, Under Armour, they have a pretty specific persona they're trying to reach with different product lines that they have, right? So you may be somebody who's a hardcore athlete and you only care about the performance of this particular shoe, or you just want to look like you've worked out even though you haven't, and you want to just look really cool walking around. All those types of people that they're trying to reach, brands have built out personas. And one of the really kind of cool things is a lot of brands sometimes have defaulted to, I've got these 3 really big names, athletes that I've signed, so I just use them for everything, right? And very, very often those folks aren't going to resonate with a certain group of people they're trying to reach. So we've done something that's kind of cool called persona modeling, where you can look at, let's say you're trying to reach this really hardcore athlete. You may have somebody who's like super young and doing great, but these hardcore athletes care about, maybe more of a legacy athlete that speaks to them better, because that's the audience that they're reaching, right? So this is a really cool way of even thinking as granular as a brand. I've got these, 4 or 5 different personas I'm trying to reach. What athletes do I have in my portfolio that's going to sell to those people the best? And that can be anything from a demographic to an interest level to a geo region. And it can be that sophisticated. So those are some of the cool things we're seeing, some brands push to get the most out of the folks that they're working with. And this can be an individual athlete, or it can be a team, or it can be a league as well, right? Where, maybe a particular league, or a particular event, like something like a Spartan race or Tough Mudder or things like that, those particular events speak to a very specific audience. And from a brand perspective, it's like, what elements of my brand or what particular product lines are going to resonate best with that audience? So that's really done by getting a really granular look at this data, and being able to see, who's going to resonate the best. So this slide that you're showing, kind of a cool project we did. Each one of those different colors represents a different persona, and it shows which one of those personas actually resonate the best with those particular sports. So they may have, in this example, this track and field one, obviously that big blue line, there's a lot of folks in that persona who look to track and field athletes. So you take that and then you go, okay, so I'm going to pick a track and field athlete, but which one? And then you kind of do that next level after that. So it's some really cool ways of taking cuts of the data and doing something about it. And this persona modeling thing is one of the, I think, more cool things we've done with some of our data recently for brands that they've found super effective.
So let's talk about a brand that I know that you work with very closely at Hookit, in New Balance. New Balance over the last couple of years have been making a big push, especially into their basketball line. Obviously, with an athlete like Kawhi Leonard, San Diego native, as we both are. But let's say New Balance is going to launch a new shoe. How would they go about choosing which influencers to use, whether it's part of a team partnership or obviously an individual athlete?
Yeah, so they can. They have a lot of data at their fingertips, and they're a really sophisticated company, which is fun for us to work with. But they use stuff like this persona modeling to get as deep as, you know what, this is the shoe that were intended for this specific audience within a specific region, within a specific age group. And then they pick out athletes that resonate the best with that particular audience. Kawhi is a bit of a an outlier because he's probably the only NBA player that isn't as engaged in social media as most, but they've been really creative to know his audience, right? Which is kind of the anti-audience, right? Which is, been forced them into being really creative on, how to market him. But, his first line of his shoes sold out in about 25 minutes after it was released. So they're doing something right? Because they realized his audience, even though he seemed like a big risk to sign, right? New Balance hadn't been in the basketball space for 20 years. Their last shoe was the James Worthy, which, for those of you that know basketball, he's been retired for quite some time. And so I think, them launching back into basketball, they took a risk with Kawhi, right? But what they did do is they were very smart about how they looked at his audience, and the content they created was authentic with him, right? And they've done an amazing job with somebody who doesn't have a huge social media presence. Like you look at somebody like Steph Curry or Kevin Durant or James Harden, like any of those guys, you can look at their social media posts and there's so many, it's awesome. But with Kawhi, it's not as frequent or at all. So they've had to be really creative with how they market and use his audience in a really productive way. But they've done some really cool stuff. So it's been fun to see, they don't have a Nike or Adidas budget. And so they have to be really smart with how they do what they do. And the Kawhi Leonard story has been a very big success for them. And, breaking into the basketball market's hard for anybody. So that's been kind of a cool project where they've used a lot of data to be smart about how they do it.
So do you see this as kind of a model that other brands can use, whether or not they have an influencer at their disposal that is like, more like a Steph Curry versus a Kawhi Leonard? It sounds like New Balance had to really get creative in how they could use their own social channels or the social channels at their disposal, since they didn't have the athlete. Do you think that's something that other brands could and should replicate, whether or not they have a big influencer on their side? It seems like they could still be doing more and getting creative. Is that something that you can see happening with other brands and other partnerships that they have?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's not very many brands that have billion-dollar sponsorship budgets, right? And I think a lot of people are, you know, in the million to multi-million dollar range where they can spend some money on somebody, and they've got to be really smart about it. So this kind of a model is something that can be replicated, right? They know who they're trying to reach generally as a brand. If not, there's data around that to help them. And then being really smart about the activations is key, right? Even something as simple as some small strategies around optimization, which is what platform, what format, what time of day to release it, and what's going to resonate and be really authentic with that audience you're trying to reach. That kind of model works for somebody who's got $100,000 to spend or somebody who's got $1 billion to spend.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And as we kind of wrap this up here, Kim, I wanted to see if there's anything in particular that you want to leave the audience with before we sign off.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's really great, I think the audience should be super excited about is this space is evolving, and there's a lot of great things you can do with data to action around it and impact it. And I'm a big fan of, rising tide lifts all boats. So if the teams and leagues have data, the brands have data, it's going to be better for the fans. You're going to reach the right fan, you're going to reach the right audience at the right time with the right message, which is kind of what everybody's trying to do. And to me, it hasn't been as engaged in the sponsorship space as it could be. So there's a lot of great room for people to do some really cool things. And a lot of that just has to be looking at the right kind of data and making sure you can do something about it. So, I'd encourage everybody to know there's ways that the sponsorship space can be a lot better with data, and we're excited to be part of that and helping be part of that rising tide lifting the boats of sponsorship.
Absolutely, and we're happy to have you along with the ride with us, Kim, and then Hookit. And so we want to thank you again for taking everyone through this, and for anybody that kind of wants to hear a continuation of this conversation, Kim and Hookit will be with us next month, in October on the 9th and 10th. Hookit's going to be talking about kind of taking the next step in this conversation, how data is evolving sponsorship. Obviously, it's a hot topic across the industry right now, something that we're going to talk about, like I said, when we go to San Francisco next month. So thanks again, Kim, for your time here today. And for anybody on the call right now or that is watching or listening to the recording, please, we hope that you'll come join us next month in San Francisco. Right now, we are in the final push, and we hope everybody can join us. Single attendee badges are $6.95, but we do have deals for 3 or more. And if you want to bring the whole team, please reach out to us, and we'll be able to work something out. So we hope to see everybody there in San Francisco next month for the National Sports Forum. I am Josh Kyles, and thanks everybody for joining today, and hope to see you in San Francisco. Thanks again, Kim.
Thanks. Everybody have a great day. And if you'd like to reach us at all, just jump on our website and learn a little bit more at hookit.com.
Yes, please. If anybody wants to connect with Kim, feel free to reach out to us. Go to their website at hookit.com, or you can reach out to us, and we'll make sure to get you connected. So don't hesitate to ask, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in San Francisco.